Taffany Blake didn't leave a note, didn't scream, didn't stumble, just parked her Civic at the Cliffside trail. Windows cracked from the heat, keys on the seat like she'd be right back. But she never came back, and what followed wasn't a search, it was a silence. A town too afraid to ask the right questions. A man too respected to suspect, and a sister who refused to let her memory rot in the wind. Because 4 years later, when a torn boot and a buried sketchbook surfaced from the cliffs, the truth began to whisper, and it wouldn't stay quiet again. She left no trace, not a scream or a stumble, or even a single footprint worth mentioning. Just her silver Honda Civic, parked neatly at the entrance of Cliffside Trail, with the windows half-cracked from the heat. A half-drunk bottle of lemon water, still sweating in the cue folder, the keys resting quietly on the seat, like she planned to come right back. Like it was just a short walk to clear her head before finishing the piece she'd been working on for days. But she never returned, and from that moment on, the sea breeze that drifted over Raven's Hollow seemed to carry her name with it, soft and unsettled, like a question no one could answer. Taffany Blake was 30, an artist with a reputation that stretched farther than her own willingness to talk about it. A woman who painted silence better than anyone who'd ever tried, who sold dreamlike landscapes to galleries she never visited twice, who kept to herself, spoke only when necessary, smiled only when it felt earned, and who somehow left everyone who met her feeling like they'd just scratched the surface of something deeper, darker, more meaningful than they'd expected. Like there was always something she was choosing not to say. And maybe that was the reason people remembered her differently, because no two people really knew the same version of her. And yet everyone remembered how she made them feel, intrigued, slightly off balance, and strangely seen. The barista at the corner cafe said she always tipped in cash and ordered the same thing, but never gave her name. Her neighbor upstairs swore she heard music after midnight, soft and eerie, like strings being played in water. And her sister Rachel, the only person who had access to her truest parts, said Taffany had changed in the last few months, not in a way you could pin down immediately, but in the way her eyes darted toward windows too often, the way she locked her door, even when she was home, the way her voice sounded like it was holding something back, and when Rachel asked about it, directly, gently, then with more frustration, Taffany would just say she was tired, working too much, nothing serious, never once hinting that she'd been having an affair with a married man, and not just any married man, but someone the entire town trusted. He was older, well-liked, polished in the way public figures tend to be, the kind of man who had built a life on board positions and backroom deals and clean reputations, with a wife who ran charity events and wore pearls to city council meetings, the kind of man who would later stand in front of the search party, the press, and the family and say he was doing everything in his power to find her, to bring her home safely. The kind of man who knew exactly how to grieve publicly while hiding the panic of what would happen if the wrong person started asking the right questions. But no one knew about that connection. Not then, not yet, because when Taffany disappeared, on that still, bright afternoon in July, it was easy for people to believe she'd gotten careless, maybe ventured off the path, maybe slipped and fell where no one could see her. Because wild places are unpredictable, and it's easier to blame the cliffs and to imagine someone walked beside her, smiled at the right moment, said all the right things, and then killed her in complete silence. Rachel was the first person who sensed it wasn't right, not just unusual, not just unsettling, but wrong in a deep, gut-level way. And it wasn't the abandoned car or the untouched trail or even the lack of any signal, but a voicemail Taffany had left 2 nights before she vanished, one that almost got deleted, one that didn't say much, but said everything. If anything weird happens, check the sketchbook, not the one in my studio, the one in the metal box under my bed. And at the time, it had sounded like a joke, or maybe just Taffany being cryptic again, But after that call from the sheriff saying they'd found her car, but not her, that message rewrote itself into something urgent and cold and terrifying. The town launched a search. Of course they did. With maps and walkie-talkies and helicopters and trained dogs, with volunteers combing through poison ivy and loose rock, calling her name into the wind like it would echo back with answers. And leading those efforts, loud and proud, was the very man who should have been looked at first, calm, helpful, organized, handing out water bottles, patting backs, meeting the press like a grieving uncle, the man who Rachel watched carefully. Because there was something off about how composed he stayed, how rehearsed he sounded when he said, "We'll find her, I promise." Like he'd practiced those exact words the night before. But they didn't find her. Not that day. Not the next. Not even after weeks of searching and hoping and handing out flyers that started curling on poles and getting rained on and forgotten. And as the seasons changed, so did the energy around her case. Because people can't carry grief forever if it isn't theirs. And eventually they started saying maybe she wandered too far. Maybe she wanted to disappear. Maybe it was no one's fault. And with no body, no blood, and no witnesses, the case slowly slid into the folder labeled unsolved. And the town went back to its usual rhythm, because that's what towns do when they can't hold on to the weight of someone else's unfinished story. But Rachel never believed the official version. Not even for a second, because she knew her sister, knew how sharp her instincts were, how cautious and deliberate she was about her routines, how she always told someone where she'd be, and the fact that she didn't this time meant something. It meant she was scared, and it meant she didn't trust anyone around her, not even enough to leave a note that the sketchbook hidden under her bed wasn't like the others. No landscapes. No faces, just names, initials, phone numbers, fragmented phrases like, "not safe," he lied. And the most disturbing of all, written in 3 different inks across 3 different pages. "He knows I know." And when Rachel handed it over to the sheriff, it got logged, then shelved, then buried like everything else that didn't match the narrative. And as time passed, it became clear that no one was going to look deeper, that no one wanted to stir up trouble, especially not when the most powerful man in town had already given them a tidy explanation. But Rachel never stopped watching, never stopped noticing how he started avoiding her gaze, how he changed his route through town, how certain photos from the original search conveniently excluded the spot Taffany had painted over and over in her journals, always in gray tones, always marked with a tiny red dot near the cliffs. And Rachel kept digging, kept asking, questions that no one wanted to answer, until eventually all she could do was wait. Wait for something to break loose, for someone to slip, for the silence to end. And 4 years later, it finally did. It began like nothing unusual, just a warm summer morning along the cliffs where a local volunteer group gathered to clear out invasive brush. The kind of slow, inconsequential work that helps people feel useful between semesters, before dinner. Plans or after retirement boredom sets in, and among them was a college student, not from Ravens Hollow, just visiting for the summer, tagging along out of curiosity more than commitment, who wandered a bit further than the others, and slipped through a narrow, forgotten crevice partly blocked by debris and salt-worn branches. And inside that quiet space between stone and shadow, she spotted something wedged in the rocks, a half-rotted boot tangled with a strip of sun-bleached cloth. And when she pulled it loose, what followed wasn't just old leather or scraps of fabric. It was a rupture in time. A door cracked open to answers buried for far too long. The sheriff's office responded immediately this time. No hesitation, no bureaucratic shuffle, because near the boot was a rusted locket containing a water-damaged photo too distorted to make out, and beneath that, wrapped tightly in a sheet of brittle plastic, was a small spiral-bound notebook, surprisingly well preserved despite years of exposure, a sketchbook. its pages curled and stained, but intact enough to open and read. And what lay inside wasn't art or landscapes or the fragments of a restless mind. It was fear, it was testimony, it was her voice. Taffany's, writing with urgency and care, her precise, slanted handwriting forming thoughts she clearly never expected anyone but herself to see. And those entries weren't simple reflections, they were warnings. She documented how she saw him watching from across the street at night, how he'd shown up outside the bookstore, at the trailhead, in places she hadn't told him she'd be. His face calm, his voice smooth, but the weight beneath his words growing heavier each time she told him it had to stop. And 1 week before she vanished, he'd come to her apartment unannounced, smiling, quiet, not angry. That was the part she kept repeating. Not angry, just distant, as if something inside him had clicked, and he wasn't there to argue anymore. He was there to warn her of consequences. She wrote, I told him I'm done. I won't protect him anymore. I won't keep pretending. And then later, he smiled when I said it. He said some things don't end just because you want them to. As the pages continued, her handwriting shifted, tighter, faster, like her hands were shaking, like sleep had become optional, and her fear was becoming constant and near. The end of the notebook, in bold, smeared ink. If I disappear, it wasn't the trail. Don't let them say it was the trail. And then the final page, the one Water had partially erased, the one with a sentence that broke in half mid-thought. He said if I talk, he'll, and nothing more. When Rachel sat in the sheriff's office, flipping through those pages under flickering fluorescent light, she didn't cry. Not then, not in front of deputies offering soft reassurances. They didn't believe themselves, because it wasn't grief that overwhelmed her. Not anymore. It was rage and vindication and a bone-deep exhaustion from holding on to what no one else wanted to hear, from knowing the truth and watching it be ignored again and again. Because while the sketchbook was evidence, it wasn't enough. Not in 1999. Not without DNA or fingerprints, just words on paper, damning but circumstantial. So the boot was bagged, the locket stored, and the notebook filed away in another folder marked pending as the case slowed back into cold silence. There was brief media attention, of course. News trucks rolled in, headlines ran for a week. Her name reappeared in cafes and town meetings. People whispered again, hoped again, speculated again, but never loudly enough to reach him, not publicly, because by then he'd mastered the art of invisibility, fading into respectability, still active in local politics, still shaking hands and smiling just enough to blend in, not vanishing, just carefully stepping out of direct light, like a man who knew his shadow had finally been seen and was waiting to see if anyone would chase it. Rachel tried again, filed letters, requested tests, begged for forensic analysis, but every appeal hit the same wall. No new suspects. Too much time passed. No viable chain of custody. Not enough lab funding. The same tired excuses repackaged as empathy. And all the while, she carried that sketchbook with her like a heartbeat she couldn't quiet, reading those pages over and over, memorizing every curve of every word until she could recite her sister's fear in her sleep. And then one night, she noticed something she'd missed before. A small scribble in the corner of a page. Just a date and a time. Friday, 5:30 p.m., Cliffside. He wants to talk, says it has to be in person. And everything clicked, because that was the exact day Taffany disappeared. And now Rachel knew for sure that this wasn't spontaneous, wasn't a mistake, wasn't a fall. It was a meeting, planned, deliberate, and likely final, and someone had walked her to that ledge under the pretense of reconciliation, stood there and smiled, said all the right things until her guard dropped, and then ended it. That one entry became Rachel's obsession, the timestamp of a murder disguised as a conversation, the evidence she knew would mean something one day, once technology. Could hear what paper couldn't scream, and so she waited, because time, unlike people, doesn't forget. And when forensic tools finally caught up, when trace blood found on a torn collar was tested with new precision, when a partial fingerprint, barely visible on the corner of a notebook page, was reanalyzed, when every element of silence was re-examined under the unforgiving clarity of science, the system, after all these years, finally returned a name. And it was his the man who stood beside the searchers. The man who placed his hand gently on Rachel's shoulder. Man who said, "We'll find her." The man who made sure she never would. And suddenly, all those quiet years weren't silence anymore. They were lies turned inside out. And now, finally, the truth had a voice again. They didn't arrest him right away. No sirens, no handcuffs in the driveway, no satisfying end to a years-long nightmare. Because cases like this don't close like doors. They creak open with resistance, hesitations, reviews, approvals. And politics, especially when the man in question has worn too many ties, shaken too many hands, left his fingerprints not just on crime scenes, but on ribbon cuttings, on charity banners, on baby photos taken at town parades. And so what? Followed wasn't justice, not yet. It was a waiting game, a delicate dance between law and image, where every step had to be double-checked, every lab result signed off, every witness re-interviewed with care, because the people who once believed in him would need more than science to see what Rachel already knew by heart. The sheriff's office reopened the case officially, called it new evidence under review. But even then, Rachel saw it in their eyes, the unease, the caution, like they were walking barefoot on glass, afraid to bleed too early. And so she kept quiet, for the most part, stayed off the record, nodded in public, and gritted her teeth in private, because she understood now what her sister had meant when she wrote that some truths are too big to whisper and too dangerous to shout. But the time for silence had ended, and every day that passed without action only deepened her resolve. She started her own kind of trial, not in a courtroom, but in memory, pulling up every conversation she'd ever had with him, every strange pause, every too careful smile. Every time he looked away just a second too long when Taffany's name came up, and she found them everywhere, the cracks in his charm, the little tells no one noticed because no one wanted to see them, the way he never asked questions, only offered sympathy, the way he always showed up after the fact, never before, the way he made himself visible just long enough to avoid suspicion, then melted back into the crowd like fog. When the warrant finally came through, a quiet early morning search of his home and office. Rachel didn't go, wasn't invited, but she sat by the phone with her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white, waiting for news like it was oxygen. And when it came, it wasn't what she expected, because they didn't find a smoking gun, not exactly. But what they did find was worse. A drawer of keepsakes, small, intimate, tucked away like relics. A scarf she'd seen Taffany wear once on a windy day by the lake, a silver bracelet bent slightly at the clasp, an envelope with photos that had never been developed but bore her sister's name on the back in thick marker. And Rachel felt the air leave her body in one long, crushing wave, because she understood then that this wasn't just violence, it was obsession, the kind that lingers long after the act, the kind that keeps souvenirs like apologies. But even that wasn't enough. Not yet, because the law doesn't work on feelings. And while the evidence painted a clear picture, it still needed the right frame, the right narrative. And that's when Rachel made a decision that changed everything. She gave the sketchbook to the press, not just excerpts, not cherry-picked lines, the whole thing scanned and uploaded, page by page, every fear, every note, every circled name and trembling sentence, and within hours, it was everywhere, not just local papers, but regional news, true crime forums, podcasts, Reddit threads filled with digital sleuths dissecting every page, matching names to faces, locations to public records. And suddenly, a case was alive in ways it had never been. No longer a whisper in a quiet town, but a storm in public view. And with public scrutiny came pressure, and with pressure came movement. They brought him in, not for the murder, not yet, but on obstruction, on tampering, on misleading investigators. And the mugshot said everything Rachel had waited to see. A man no longer composed, no longer rehearsed, just tired and cornered, his mask finally slipping. And in that moment, she didn't feel victory or vengeance, just release. Like the scream she'd been holding in for 4 years had finally found air. The trial didn't come quickly, but it came a year later, in a courthouse 2 counties over to avoid conflict of interest. And Rachel sat through every minute of it, listening to experts testify about soil samples, DNA degradation, forensic aging, and then, finally, the entries from the sketchbook, read aloud by a state investigator with a voice that trembled more. With each page, and when they reached the final words, "If I disappear," it wasn't the trail. The room fell into the kind of silence that only comes when truth is no longer avoidable. The defense tried to poke holes, of course, called the relationship complicated, called the evidence inconclusive, painted Taffany as emotional fragile, confused, and Rachel almost walked out when they said her sister had a tendency toward drama, because it was exactly the kind of story women like Taffany get written into when they go missing. Emotional, erratic, possibly unstable, but this time there was a counter-story, stronger, sharper, held up by science and testimony, and the pages she left behind, like breadcrumbs for justice. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, Rachel didn't cry then either. She didn't collapse or scream or hug strangers. She just stood still, one hand on the bench in front of her, breathing like she'd forgotten how. Because after all the years, all the doubt, all the waiting, the silence had finally given way to a voice. And that voice had been heard. They asked her later if she wanted to say anything to the press, and she only said this: "My sister wasn't a ghost. She was warning us the whole time. We just had to listen." And for the first time since that summer day in 1995, Ravens Hollow remembered her not as the girl who vanished, but as the woman who wouldn't be forgotten.